And in this video, we'll look at an actual passage from the Bible. We'll look specifically at Isaiah's vocation story. This is from Isaiah chapter 6. And we can divide this into 3 different parts, and we'll look at the first part, verses 1 through 5, God's first manifestation to Isaiah. And that's what this verb see indicates. This verb often indicates throughout the Old Testament when a prophet is seeing a vision of God. The Lord is manifesting to him. The other thing that's useful to note, in the year that King Uzziah died, the prophet is always located within a specific context, within a specific historic event time period. And it just really emphasizes again and again that the prophets don't deal with something abstract or theoretical, but something very concrete and practical. They are co-involved with their community, just as God is. But what is it that Isaiah sees? He sees the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. This is the Lord's celestial throne, from which he wields power and authority. But even though the Lord's throne is a heavenly throne, that is, that God is transcendent, his train filled the temple, and that this idea of the Lord filling the temple, filling the earth, repeats elsewhere. The whole earth is full of his glory. The house was filled with smoke. Remember, the temple is on earth, so God is high. He's up in the heavens, and yet there are these aspects that come down, that from his throne, his train comes down and fills the temple, which is on earth. So God is utterly transcendent and yet still immanent. He is completely separate from us and yet completely within our midst. And this emphasis again and again on filling means that there's no aspect of reality that God doesn't touch. And then we have a description of the angels. And the angels are calling to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." You'll probably recognize this from the Mass. This is where we get it. This triple holy means that God is the holiest. The original Hebrew doesn't have a word for holiest, so they just repeat 3 times to indicate the most holy. And then how does Isaiah respond to this? He responds in a somewhat curious way, and Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I am lost." So he's in distress. He's receiving this vision of the Lord, which most of us would be ecstatic to have some sort of tangible revelation like that. But Isaiah responds, "Woe is me, for I am lost," and that's because within the context of the Old Testament, seeing the Lord means death. So this is a terrible event, and he thinks he's going to die. "For I am a man of unclean lips." How can something unclean stand to be in the presence of the holiest, the holy, holy, holy? Unclean lips. The lips are the instruments of prayer. So if his lips are unclean, then how can he pray? He has nothing that he can possibly say to the Lord. And remember, this is especially problematic because remember, Isaiah is an example of a prophet who's been invited into the holy court, who has been invited to address God even before, has been invited to make direct interventions directly before God. And then finally, this Lord of hosts presents God as a warrior. Let me just check something here. As the God is the warrior, he's the leader of heavenly and earthly armies. So here in the second part, verses 6 and 7, let me just move my camera down a little bit. There we go. Notice, I'll just read it all the way through. "Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongues from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, 'Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is forgiven.'" Notice how Isaiah doesn't do anything, and it doesn't record any of his feelings, any of his opinions, any of his thoughts. It's just an objective account of what happens. And notice it's the angels, one of the seraphim. Seraphim are a type of angel who comes to him. This is entirely God's initiative. There's nothing that Isaiah can do that can cleanse his lips and make them worthy of prayer and of addressing the Lord. But notice, behold, this has touched your lips. Remember, on the previous slide, we talked about how his lips were uncleaned. But now, this burning coal, fire, is often a symbol of purification. After this burning coal touches his lips, his guilt is taken away and his sins forgiven, and therefore he's been made worthy to address the Lord. Wow, that ended up being really tiny. So then finally, in the last part of the vocation story, Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord. So it's involving his other senses, but not just his sight anymore. Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? The Lord can send whoever he wants. So what's going on in this question? This repetition indicates that God is looking for someone who is capable of going. And then notice Isaiah's response. Then I said, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah is no longer afraid. His lips have been purified. He is able to address the Lord now. "Here am I, send me." And notice that there's no description of the mission. Isaiah has no idea what he's getting himself into. But he's willing to do it. He's willing to stand ready and to go wherever he needs to go to fulfill God's mission, which is, as we know, the concern of God for his people. All right, just give me a second. Just need to look at my notes. So then God describes the mission to him. Go and say this to my people. To go and say to this people. So this is an important distinction that will appear throughout the prophets. The difference between this people and my people. And this phrase always indicates the state of the relationship between God and the Israelites. Whenever God says something like this people, they're in a bad way, and they're far from God. But whenever God says my people, then indicates that the Israelites are close to God, that they're still in this right relationship with God. And this is what Isaiah is to say: hear and hear, but do not understand; see and see, but do not perceive. That means that the mission is going to fail, that Isaiah will not be successful. And this reveals, God already knows that it's not going to work, that the people are too stubborn. And he sends Isaiah anyways. So he's concerned for his people. He's concerned for this people, even in their obstinacy, even when they're not going to turn back to him, even when they're far from him. He's still concerned. He's always concerned. He always cares about his people. He always cares about us. So then Isaiah asks, "How long, O Lord?" So this suffering, this distance between them, isn't going to last forever. There will be an end. And we know there will be an end because Isaiah asks when it will be. So then, a couple other things to keep in mind. So cities lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without men, and the land is utterly desolate. This is a way of saying everything. Cities, land, everything's going to be desolated. So that there's going to be a terrible event, terrible suffering, great crisis. But remember, it's not going to last forever. We don't know how long it'll last, but it's not going to last forever. And even then, even in the midst of all this, there's going to be a stump remaining. So as terrible as it is, it's not going to be complete. There's always going to be hope. That God will save his people, that there will be salvation at the end. And so that's where I'll leave off for this week, and next week we'll look at some other aspects of the prophets.